Volume 4 of Good Mike Works pay-per-view and DVD reviews. This week, Breaking the Code, Behind the Walls of Chris Jericho DVD. I chose this one because I really like Chris Jericho. I know in my last review, I reviewed the Fully Loaded 2000 pay-per-view, which Chris Jericho was a big part of, but Chris Jericho's career is honestly one of my favorites that there has ever been. I've always admired and loved the road that he had traveled to get to the position that he made it in pro wrestling, and I'm a huge fan of Chris Jericho professionally and personally. I think Chris Jericho represents pro wrestling very well. I'm always so proud whenever he is the one that goes on these talk shows or, any situation like that where, the mainstream media is introduced to a pro wrestler, and I think Chris Jericho represents himself and our business very, very well and very professionally, and it's just so refreshing to see a pro wrestler that's so normal and down to earth and intelligent as Chris Jericho is, and I'm a huge fan of his. This DVD, I think, is about 4 years old now. It was released in 2010. As usual with my DVD reviews, I am only reviewing the regular, normal DVD release that comes out. I do not have the Blu-ray version of this, and I do know that in the Blu-ray versions, a lot of times there's more extras, more Easter eggs, and a lot more bonus material. This DVD was jam-packed, let me tell you. I think Chris Jericho actually took a lot of time deciding what matches and stories he wanted to show and tell, and it was a great collection. One of my favorite collections, on a one single wrestler that they've done. And I'm going to go through it all. We're going to go through a match listing, and I'll also talk about some of the extra bonus features that they included on the DVD, and I'll pretty much just review the whole damn thing. And of course, we're going to start with the documentary because that's the best part. The story starts off with Jericho talking about how he grew up in Winnipeg. Of course, they interviewed his mom and dad, and his dad was an NHL player. I remember hearing that way back in the day, thinking that was so cool that this guy came from a former NHL player. They start off the story, of course, talking about Chris's childhood, how he grew up in Winnipeg, Canada. They interviewed his mom and dad. His dad played hockey for the New York Rangers and was a pretty decent-sized star in the NHL. Like most of these documentaries, there's a lot of home movies of Chris Jericho as a kid, doing various things, hanging out with friends, playing sports, shit like that. A lot of good footage and early stuff from Chris Jericho showing, how he grew up and what the life was like for him growing up in Canada. He says that he discovered wrestling and music about the same age. Around age 8, he discovered the AWA and also became a big fan of the Beatles, which is oddly very similar to myself. The AWA was my first memory of pro wrestling, and the Beatles were one of my first memories of music, and I think that's why I relate so well to Chris Jericho, because we have a lot in common. Although I was never in a high school band, which Chris Jericho was, they interviewed a lot of his friends from back then, a lot of his bandmates, talking about some of the times they had and the music they made. During high school is when he said he started watching Stampede Wrestling, and during one of the shows he saw the ad come up for the end of the show: if you're interested in training to become a pro wrestler, write to this address, blah blah blah. He sent in his shit. To about a year or so later, after getting a degree of some kind at a communications school, he ends up going to wrestle at the HART camp, and the very first guy he met there was Lance Storm. They tell the story that they went in there, and you know how some of these wrestling schools can go. You guys, I'm sure, some of you might have been to one or seen them on TV. Generally, when you go into, just a basic, everybody shows up on the first day wrestling school, you see a lot of out-of-place people, horrendously out of shape, small, skinny, just absolutely have no potential or no future whatsoever. You don't see too many Mick Foleys. There's only one Mick Foley. It's very rare to have a guy that looks like that can be such a great talent. I'm not saying that they're not out there, but, these people that were attending this wrestling school, apparently with Jericho and Lance Storm, was some of the worst, most out-of-shape and horrendous athletes they had ever seen. So it was clear right away that if anybody was going to make it in that camp, it was going to be Jericho or Storm or both. So they latched onto each other right away and became really good friends and, had a good run in the Canadian Indies, and they were both fantastic. Lance Storm was great. I wish Lance Storm would have had more success in the wrestling business because he was awesome. But I think Jericho just had the slight edge on the look, the long hair, the charisma. He had a little bit more of that than Lance Storm, but still, Storm was a great wrestler. I'm a huge fan of his too. The training footage was really cool. Chris and Lance, would basically just wrestle matches together probably constantly because they were the only two that could have good matches with each other. And the training footage was pretty awesome, and they worked all over the Canadian independents and worked with each other pretty much constantly. After doing that for a while, a fellow wrestler and friend of Chris Jericho's who lived in Calgary got a job in Mexico and asked Chris Jericho if he would like to come along with him to form a tag team. So Chris Jericho said absolutely and moved down to Mexico City. and worked in Mexico for 2 years. He began working for EMLL, and that's where he was given the Lionheart gimmick originally, and he worked the Lucha Libre style and was able to learn, the Mexican style of wrestling and gained a ton of experience and got really famous. He said that was the first time he had ever experienced that sort of popularity. He was on the cover of magazines, women were screaming and throwing their panties at him, and I think it was just really overwhelming for him and a really good overall life experience, and he just learned a ton down there in Mexico working that style. It was so awesome. After working the 2 solid years in Mexico, he heads off to Germany for just a couple of months, and he tells the story of how he had to work the same match every night in the same building in front of the same fans. So in order to keep things as fresh as possible, he had to change things up and tweak up his matches a bit and try to do things that the fans wouldn't expect because they are picking apart the product and they see it night after night after night, and a lot of times they know what the wrestler is going to do before they do it, and it was up to Jericho and his opponents to make things different for the crowd. And he said he learned a ton in that short time in Germany, and it was some of the experiences and the things he learned he still uses to this day in the ring. He reunited with Lance Storm, and they came to the United States. This was actually Chris Jericho's first time ever wrestling in the United States. And they joined Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and I think it's really funny because I remember watching Smoky Mountain Wrestling back then, and Chris Jericho and Lance Storm stuck out like a sore thumb in that Southern style. It's even funny how he even mentions that he really didn't learn anything there. He got great experience cutting a promo, but as far as, work in the ring and a few basic tricks aside, there was nothing he was going to learn in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I have a few of their matches from that territory, and they showed a few on the DVD as well, and you can tell their opponents were just completely out of their league, trying to keep up with these 2 young athletic kids that were just flying all over the place. So their time in Smoky Mountain was short-lived, but from there, Chris Jericho went to Japan. He mentioned that Ultimo Dragon was the guy that actually helped get him to Japan because he worked with Ultimo Dragon so much in Mexico, and he was really instrumental to Chris Jericho getting the job over in Japan. He worked for WAR, Wrestling and Romance, which wasn't a company that was quite as big as New Japan and All Japan, but it was still pretty well known. They didn't talk too much about the Japan stuff, and it sucks too because a lot of what he did there and a lot of the photos that they were trying to show, for example, the ones of the Super J Cup, I think it was in 1995, it's a shame because Chris Benoit was also a part of that tournament, and you could tell that they really had to kind of, scale down how much they would have talked about that, especially with the photos and everything. It's just kind of just little pictures of Jericho here or there, and they're trying to do everything they can do to avoid talking about Benoit. And that would also be a problem later on in the DVD when they talk about his WWE career, because Chris Benoit was a huge opponent for Chris Jericho and has a lot to do with the career of Chris Jericho, and it's a shame that they had to leave all of that out. But Jericho really learned a lot in Japan. It's so interesting how he went to all these different territories and learned all of these different styles, and then when he came back to the United States after Japan, he joined ECW, which was perfect for a guy like Chris Jericho, because Chris Jericho mentions it several times in the DVD, the tape traders. I was one of those tape traders. I knew who Chris Jericho was in 1994 and 1995, where Vince McMahon, there's probably no way he knew. But Paul Heyman knew, and Jim Cornette knew, and Mick Foley knew, and I think Foley actually helped get Jericho to ECW, if I remember the story correctly. I actually think Foley gave Paul Heyman a tape of Jericho from probably Japan. And Jericho was such a perfect fit for ECW because at that time, in those early days of ECW, they were focusing a lot on international talent. They were bringing guys in from everywhere, and a lot of these guys Chris Jericho, was familiar with, or at least familiar with the style, and, he just fit in perfectly. And they even showed footage of, one of his classic matches he had, with Cactus Jack that really helped get him on the map as a tougher type guy, because he had the long hair and the colorful outfit, and he was a little bit flamboyant. So to bring out this tougher side of Chris Jericho, it was really good for his career, and it's something we didn't see again until, fully loaded, 2000. But just like Benoit, just like Eddie Guerrero, Chris Jericho wasn't going to spend that much time in ECW because it was only a matter of time before he would make the jump to WCW. And he tells the story of meeting Eric Bischoff at Antonio Inoki's World Wrestling Peace Festival that year, and Bischoff just approached him, introduced himself, and offered him a job on the spot. And that was typical WCW, as an insider and as a tape trader. At the time, I remember when Chris Jericho was in ECW, I knew that there was no chance he was going to go to the WWE. WCW was the company that was signing those type of wrestlers, and of course, you know, they had a lot of money to throw around, so, you know, they just offered him a contract that the WWE probably could never offer him, plus the WWE probably didn't even know who the fuck he was. So it was one of those things where all those guys, you just knew what company they were going to wind up in, and WCW was building an enormous and strong undercard with a lot of great talent, and those cruiserweight matches were so instrumental in WCW's success during that time. And Jericho goes into that a great deal. You know, he's always been adamant for years that a big part of WCW's success were those cruiserweight matches, because if you're watching Nitro and it's a 2-hour show, you know, there's a lot you have to watch to get to the main event. There's a lot of in-between stuff between the opening segment and the final segment, and when you watch WWE, you know, you might be getting the New Rockers versus the Bushwhackers, where in WCW, you could be getting Dean Malenko versus Chris Jericho. And had it not been for those matches, I don't know if the ratings would have stayed so strong for WCW, because you have to think about it. People are tuning in for Goldberg and the NWO, but something has to keep them tuned in. And if the quality of the matches are fantastic, they're not going to switch over to Raw to see what's going on there. And the first year or so that Jericho was in WCW, it was really tough for him because he was a squeaky clean babyface, and this was at the beginning of the Attitude Era. It was the absolute worst character someone could be at the time, and Jericho had a hard time getting over, and he wasn't looking very good, and his matches weren't very good, and he just really wasn't that happy. I think it took something like over a year before they finally turned him heel, and that's when Jericho started getting hilarious. Now, this is some of my favorite times in Chris Jericho's career because of how entertaining he was. You know, and when you look back at how, you know, just what a clusterfuck WCW was, you know, they really let Chris Jericho, you know, come up with his own shit. Anything you see Chris Jericho do on Nitro that cracked you up, he probably came up with on his own. The creative team didn't tell him to do it. He did it. The reason for that is because WCW doesn't have any future plans for Chris Jericho. He's just a guy on their roster. He's not one of the main guys, and they're not paying attention to him, and they just say, fine, go out and do whatever you want. We're not going to push you anyway. And what does Jericho do? He goes out there and gets himself over as a hilarious crybaby heel. His promos were hilarious. He always had great one-liners, and he would throw in little, you know, funny, you know, pop culture references that maybe a lot of people wouldn't even get. I love the stuff he did with Dean Malenko when, you know, he's interviewing the poster of Dean Malenko, and then, you know, after Malenko beats him in, I think, the Battle Royal, when he was dressed as Super Calo, Jericho goes to Washington, D.C., and they did all those vignettes where he's going in the library and interviewing people on the streets, you know, and trying to find the official pro wrestling rules, you know, so he can, you know, I guess sue or try to get his belt back from WCW because he was so wrongly screwed out of it. You know, just hilarious shit, and there was no writing for this. They just, you know, they were just ad-libbing everything and just improvising everything they were doing, and it's just fucking brilliant shit. I also love the way he would just completely fuck up his hair on purpose. He had that big, long, blonde hair, and sometimes he would just tease it all up in the air with hairspray, and it would be really big, or he would tie ponytails in all 3 different directions or out the side, or, you know, just making himself look like an idiot, and he said that he was just amusing himself. That's all he was doing. I think the whole time he saw the writing on the wall in WCW, so he used this time, you know, to keep himself amused and to keep himself happy, and he did a fucking great job with this character. I think my absolute favorite thing that he did, we all love it, is the fucking holds. And you know what? I haven't really been putting clips in these DVD reviews because I just want it to be me talking about it. But there is no way I can do this segment justice. It is just too funny. So we'll take a look at a quick clip from the DVD of Chris Jericho talking about his 1,004 holds.
You know, this other time I was working with Dean, who said he was the man of 1,000 holds, and I was like, well, I'm the man of 1,004 holds. I know 4 more. I'm 4 better than you.
Anybody who knew my moniker was a man of 1,000 holds, so he kind of tried to one-up me by having 4 more holds than me.
And we showed up at the arena and had this idea that I would read my list of 1,004 holds. I took a cup of water. I was like, now I'm going to read my 1,004 holds, starting with
hold 1, arm drag. Hold 2,
arm bar.
Hold 3, the moss-covered, 3-handled family gradunzel.
He would take certain things that the guys gave to him, and he would just run with them. They were highly entertaining.
Why doesn't he just mail us this list and we'll announce it?
Bar.
He's just ranting.
Number 5, the Saskatchewan spinning nerve hold.
This must be meathead microphone night. You think so?
He's
got 998 to go.
9,
get the hook. We're out of here. Shut up.
We go to commercial break, and then I stop reading my list, which is like this big stack of connected computer paper. And then I start, you know, we were in Chicago, so I just started talking about, you know, the Bulls suck, the Blackhawks suck, the Bears suck. So when we came back from break, I just finished my all Chicago sports teams suck. So everyone's chanting Jericho sucks, and then I'm still reading the holds.
We're back, fans.
Hold number 712.
Can we
arm bar?
Can we physically
Hold
get him out of the ring?
713.
It was just this ridiculous thing, and it was so much fun to do. And the best part was they had this guy called Prince Iaukea come to the ring.
Hold number 805, the Super Blizzard. Hold number 7.
My holds flew in the air, and I was like, my holds! My holds!
Give me my holds!
They just wanted my holds to be safe, you know? So that's kind of like, it was just completely just keeping myself amused, but as a result, I was amusing, you know, millions of people.
I still got 200 more! I got 200 more holds to lift!
And suddenly I became this over character, much to the chagrin of the entire WCW office.
Oh my god, that shit never gets old. I think my favorite hold was the swim. I swear, I could watch that segment once a day. It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in wrestling. But back to the story, they do go into detail about the Goldberg situation. And I remember at the time, you know, as being a hotline guy, I remember as this was unfolding and me being one of the people that was really pissed off. You know, the stories on the dirt sheets were talking about how highly uncooperative Goldberg was being in this whole situation, and it was angering a lot of people, and it really illustrated, you know, what a clusterfuck of a mess WCW was, especially backstage with the politics and everything, because they just missed so many good opportunities. For as many things as they did right, you know, they could have been so much better if they would have actually just not allowed these guys to have these egos and this bullshit, you know, and Goldberg was so green and inexperienced and immature, but at the same time, when you look at the environment that Goldberg was in, he was only behaving, you know, the way he was observing others of his stature behaving. And he looks down at someone like Chris Jericho, which is ironic because a guy like Chris Jericho could wrestle circles around Bill Goldberg, and there's absolutely no comparison whatsoever in their wrestling experience or ability, none at all. But the angle they did in WCW was good. You guys remember that? You know, Jericho would come out and call Bill Goldberg out when he knew he wasn't in the building or he was preoccupied or something like that. You know, and then he referred to him as Greenberg, and then he kept winning these fake matches against Goldberg, whether he would beat an imposter or it would be a count out because Goldberg wouldn't show up. Next thing you know, it's Jericho 5, Goldberg nothing, and the fans were behind it. I remember watching it on Nitro. I thought it was a hilarious segment, and I would have loved to see that match on pay-per-view. And that was Chris Jericho's whole point, you know, as they went through all of this crap, you know, and then just to have Goldberg squash Jericho in, you know, 1 minute on Nitro, and he's like, come on, let's sell this match. What the hell have we been working for 2 months for? You know, if you're just gonna end it and blow the whole thing off in 60 seconds on free TV, that's fucking retarded. And it caused a lot of heat between Goldberg and Jericho that would last several years before they finally made up. But still, it's one of those things where you just shake your head because WCW is so stupid. You know, Jericho, of course, would have gotten killed by Goldberg. You know, Goldberg would have eventually squashed him, beat his ass, retained his title. Jericho wasn't going to beat Goldberg or anything like that. But the way they were building up the feud, you at least have to put the match on pay-per-view, and it at least has to be longer than a minute. And I agree totally with Chris Jericho. It was fucking bullshit, and from that point on, all he wanted to do was get out of WCW, and he was focused on the WWE. So everything we're going to talk about from here until the end of the review is going to be about Chris Jericho's WWE career. So I think this would be as good a time as any to go through the great match listing and some of the extras that are on this DVD. It's some really good shit. Disc 1, of course, includes the documentary. There's a few special features on this disc as well, a bunch of stories, including one really funny story about Jericho's ring name that he had picked out, apparently since he was a teenager. And this was going to be the name that once he made it in wrestling was going to take him to the top. And I think when he met Lance Storm and maybe another local promoter, he told him the name and they laughed in his face. What was the name, you ask? It was Jack Action. Isn't that the funniest fucking name you've ever heard? I think that would be great. I would love to see Jack Action as WWE Champion. As a matter of fact, I would love to see Jack Action and Dude Love as WWE Tag Team Champions. I thought that was a hilarious story. He told another funny Paul Heyman story, and Joey Styles had a pretty cute story about Mr. Salty Pretzels, which I thought was pretty good. They also talk a little bit more of the origin of his Lionheart gimmick that started in Mexico, a couple of Thrill Seekers promos from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, 2 really funny promos from 2 separate editions of WCW Thunder in 1998. They also had that awesome backstage promo on Raw with Jericho, Michael Cole, and The Rock. I think that was in late 2000. They show a post-Raw clip of Jericho and Austin drinking beer together, and there's also a Fozzy music video, and I think one or two other things. But all in all, there's a pretty good amount of special features and funny little stories on that first disc. The other two discs are just matches. Disc 2 starts off with an introduction by Chris Jericho saying that he handpicked these matches. They were important to him. And like I said earlier, it's unfortunate that they had to leave off so many Benoit matches. There probably would have been at least 2 or 3 of them on here. But still, the matches are very good, and Jericho took a lot of time, in putting these matches together. And I think they did well. Disc 2 starts off with Cowboy Chris Jericho versus Lance T. Storm. By the way, the T stands for Thunder. This match took place in Calgary in October of 1990, and there's also an alternate commentary by Jericho and Matt Stryker. You get the Thrill Seekers versus the Infernos from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, March 12, 1994. Chris Jericho versus the Ultimo Dragon for the International Junior Heavyweight Championship from Japan, July 7, 1995. Also, there's an alternate commentary on this match as well by Jericho and Matt Stryker. We get Chris Jericho versus Cactus Jack, ECW Hardcore TV, March 12, 1996. WCW Cruiserweight Championship match, Chris Jericho versus Eddie Guerrero from Fall Brawl, 1997. They gave us the mask match from WCW Super Brawl 1998, Chris Jericho versus Juventud Guerrera. That was actually a mask first title match. Another Cruiserweight title match, Chris Jericho and Dean Malenko from Nitro on July 27th, 1998. And the final WCW match on here was also a Cruiserweight title match between Jericho and Dean Malenko from July 27th, 1998 Nitro. We get Jericho's debut next. The Millennium Clock expires and his whole promo with The Rock. Then you get an Intercontinental title match between Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle, No Way Out 2000. We get the WWE title match, which we'll talk about in a little bit, between Jericho and Triple H from Raw in April of 2000. WCW title match between Chris Jericho and The Rock from No Mercy of 2001. The Undisputed Championship match between Jericho and Stone Cold at Vengeance. This was when Jericho became the Undisputed Champion. That was a crazy night. Disc 3, we get a no DQ match between Jericho and Hogan from SmackDown, May of 2002. This was when Hulk Hogan was the WWE Undisputed Champion. Of course, we're going to get the Chris Jericho, Shawn Michaels WrestleMania 19 match. That also has an alternate commentary by Jericho and Stryker. We get the match that got Chris Jericho fired against John Cena in August of 2005. And then we get his re-debut when he returned to the WWE in 2007 on Monday Night Raw. We get that whole promo. I think Randy Orton was in the ring during that. A great Intercontinental title match between Chris Jericho and Jeff Hardy from Raw on March 10th, 2008 is on here. The ladder match from No Mercy 2008 with Jericho and Shawn Michaels is also on here. That was great. The Extreme Rules match he had against Rey Mysterio is on here. That was a no-holds-barred match for the IC title. That was June 2009. We also get Chris Jericho versus The Undertaker from SmackDown, November 13th, 2009. And the final match on the DVD is Chris Jericho versus Edge for the WWE World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 26. Man, this 3-disc set is loaded. Now we're on to the biggest stage of Chris's career, and that's when he makes it to the WWE. After the Goldberg debacle in WCW and how unhappy he was, finally his contract is up, and he can make the move to the WWE, which he did in August of 1999. His debut was awesome. To this day, one of the most memorable things I can ever remember during the Monday Night Wars time was that Monday night on Raw when Chris Jericho debuted. I've mentioned many times that I was in the know during this time, and of course I knew that this was going to be Chris Jericho. A lot of fans did. The internet was now a little bit up and running. The dirt sheets were everywhere, and everyone knew that Chris Jericho was going to be the guy to debut. I even remember at the time, before he came in, there was rumors that the WWE was going to call him Excalibur, and they were going to actually change his name, and the fans were fucking losing it. I was one of them. I was so excited to see Chris Jericho come to the WWE because it was Chris Jericho coming to the WWE. At that time, even though WCW was in the shitter, still, when you score a talent of that magnitude that jumps ship, it's still a big deal. Why change his name and pretend he's somebody else? To me, that's a big feather in the WWE's hat to get one of the WCW's talents, because that's how WCW got popular in the first place, was by doing the same thing to the WWE. And his debut was awesome. I mean, people had that clock counted down. As soon as the very first countdown showed up, people did the math, and tried to come up with when exactly the clock was going to, reach zero. And then they played it so perfectly where The Rock is just in the ring cutting his promo at the very time that the clock runs out, and Chris Jericho makes his debut, and the fans went nuts. I mean, first the fireworks hit and then the music starts, but the crowd really popped when Jericho's name flashes on the screen, and then they go nuts, the lights come up, and there's Jericho standing there, arms out, back to the crowd. One of the most successful debuts in wrestling history easily. Once this debut happened, you were like, holy shit, the WWE is going to use Chris Jericho in a huge way, and they're going to capitalize on what WCW failed to capitalize on. But then all of a sudden, after this epic debut, Chris Jericho kind of goes away. I don't remember him doing anything at SummerSlam except cutting a promo. I was at the first pay-per-view he wrestled on, Unforgiven 1999, actually, had a little incident with Chris Jericho that night and got to have a few beers with him. Told the story a couple times on previous commentaries. But his match that evening was against X-Pac, and I was in the crowd, and the fans were chanting boring. I remember getting so pissed off, like looking around, I'm like, these are two of the best workers in the company having a match out there, and you fuckers are shitting on it just because you want to see Stone Cold Steve Austin be a fucking guest referee in the main event. It was that dumb fucking Southern crowd that drove me so crazy. They're in there shitting on this great match that's in the ring, or these two great workers. They're not giving them a chance. The fans are not interested. They're completely detached, and they're just waiting for Austin, who's not even working that night. He's just fucking, making an appearance in the main event just to help sell tickets. And they're ignoring Jericho and X-Pac's match because, they just want to see Stone Cold. And then a month later at No Mercy, Jericho tells the story on the DVD. That was the pay-per-view where Matt and Jeff Hardy and Edge and Christian had that great ladder match that really helped put those two teams on the map, and Jericho wasn't even booked for the show. And I was one of the biggest Jericho fans there was at the time, and I remember being frustrated myself. I'm like, why are they not doing anything with Jericho? I want to see Jericho on TV. It's so awesome to see him there, after he was in WCW, because at the time it was always exciting, to me anyway, as a fan personally, when anyone would change sides or jump ship, because to me it was so surreal to see a character that I was so used to seeing in one environment, suddenly change to another one. It just makes it all that more interesting. And even though I hated it when WWF guys went to WCW, to me it was still interesting to see these guys jump ship. I almost shit myself when Rick Rude was on Raw and Nitro on the same night. I like seeing the Giant come to the WWE. I like seeing Chris Jericho come to the WWE. I like seeing Jeff Jarrett go from WWE to WCW a couple of different times. I was always really into that. So Jericho was new, he was fresh, he was hot. A lot of fans were happy to see him there, and the WWE's not doing anything with him and booking him on pay-per-views. And they're just not utilizing, the heat, the buzz that he had when he first came in. It was really slow going for a while there with Chris Jericho until finally they decide, hey, why don't we put him with our female Intercontinental Champion who had just defeated Jeff Jarrett, who had just taken off for WCW in that whole debacle. Jericho is the exact type of wrestler that should be winning the Intercontinental title. When you look at their roster and the type of Intercontinental Champions that they had, in recent history, everybody, that was when the Intercontinental title was really on the decline. Everybody had it by that point. Val Venus, Albert, D'Lo, Godfather, you name it, they were just basically giving that Intercontinental title to everybody. So when Chris Jericho, first confronted China, I was jumping for joy. I'm like, okay, the IC title's not dead yet. Because if Chris Jericho wins it, then finally it'll have a little bit of prestige to it, and it has that, it goes back to that title being the workhorse title when guys like Perfect and Brett and Shawn, when they were holding that title, later on in the WWE, when Benoit and Jericho were passing it around, that reminded me of an earlier time. And I really wasn't that thrilled with the Jericho-China feud because in my mind, Jericho was such a good wrestler, he should be in the ring with other good wrestlers having good matches. But Jericho mentions in the DVD that even though he was disappointed himself in having to work with China, at least that meant he was probably going to get the Intercontinental title. And I felt the exact same way. That's the exact same thought I had in my mind when I was watching this feud. So it was kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel of just a horrible situation, a poor angle, a poor feud, and an overall poor use of Chris Jericho. They don't talk too much about his Intercontinental title reign. I mean, a lot of his matches and his title wins came against Chris Benoit, and like I said, they can't really show a lot of that stuff, and that's a shame because that ladder match they had at the Royal Rumble 2001, I believe, was one of the best matches I've ever seen. And it's just such a shame about how much they had to leave out of this Chris Jericho story because of what Chris Benoit did. But they start talking about his feud with Stephanie McMahon next in the DVD. And they got into how all of that started and the funny segments between Chris Jericho and Stephanie on the mic, especially when Chris Jericho would come out and cut a promo on her with the whole filthy, dirty, bottom-feeding, trash bag hoe stuff. This eventually leads to the great angle on Monday Night Raw. Still another one of my favorite memories from Raw because it was so shocking. It was the opening match. It was Chris Jericho versus Triple H. This was right after WrestleMania 2000. Triple H, I think, was in the ring. Chris Jericho comes out, starts cutting a promo, insulting him, insulting Stephanie McMahon, and somehow convinces Triple H to have a match with Jericho and to put the title on the line. At the time, this was when Triple H and Stephanie and Shane were kind of having the feud with Earl Hebner, and I remember being at one of these shows in Richmond, Virginia. I think it was on a SmackDown where Earl Hebner got the crap beaten out of him. So they've already got the angle going between Triple H and the referee, and Earl is refereeing the Triple H-Chris Jericho match, and even the Acolytes are out there, providing protection for Chris Jericho. Seems like Jericho has all his bases covered. He hits Triple H with the Lion Salt, and Earl Hebner hits Triple H with a fast count, 1, 2, 3. One of the biggest pops I can ever remember seeing on Monday Night Raw. I mean, the crowd was like, it was almost like a what the fuck pop. I was watching it at home and my jaw dropped. I'm like, wait a minute, we're going to have a WWE title change, in the opening segment of Monday Night Raw. There's no ratings reason to do this. WCW was in the toilet. There's nothing the WWE needed to do to win in the ratings every week. They were going to win anyway. So having a segment like that was just, to me, I was like, wow, after all of this with Triple H, his run, he's going to lose the title like that. But of course, with the fast count, they go to commercial break, they come back, and they basically force Earl Hebner to reverse his decision, which means Chris Jericho held the WWE title just for, 20 minutes or so. Jericho actually walks back out to the ramp with the title around his waist, and it was just seeing that was like, wow, Jericho just got here in August. He was off to such a slow, horrible start, and now here he is in the beginning of 2000, and he's won the WWE title, and even though they took it off of him, he was made by that point because that meant that the WWE was teasing the fans, hey, this is what you could be seeing from Chris Jericho in the future. Michael Hayes was interviewed on the DVD, and he actually says that looking back, he thinks the WWE made the wrong call and should have kept the belt on Chris Jericho. I kind of disagree. As a Chris Jericho fan, I can speak unbiasedly about this. You got to remember, at the time, even though Jericho was there, even though he had great potential, he just got there in August, and this was April of the next year. And Triple H was as hot as ever, and so was The Rock, who was right on his tail and who was about to beat him for the title at Backlash. So Jericho winning would really put the brakes on all of that, and I disagree with putting the belt on Jericho at that time. I'm glad they did the angle. It was just a little tease for the fans, and it was a way just to help make Jericho, but at the same time keeping the belt on Hunter, keeping his feud going with The Rock, because that's what the fans wanted to see. You remember that Backlash pay-per-view 2000? Maybe I'll review that in the future. That was a great pay-per-view, a great moment, a great main event, and with Jericho winning the title, that wouldn't have happened. So I think it was the right decision, and I think it was a breakthrough moment for Chris Jericho, because after that, he had a ton of confidence. He was having great pay-per-view matches. The quality of his work went up drastically, and the quality of his opponents did too. The DVD actually skips through the next year and a half or so, just interviewing a few wrestlers, talking about how great it is working with Jericho and how unique of a performer he is and things like that. And they actually go all the way up and fast forward to Vengeance, where he beats Austin and Rock in the same night to be the first ever Undisputed Champion. He did need a lot of help. He mentioned in the DVD that it took about 6 guys to help him get the job done, but he did in fact defeat The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin in the same night. No matter how he did it, he still did it, and he made history that night, became the first ever Undisputed Champion, and I had myself was swerved. I did not think that Angle or Jericho had a chance to win these titles. It was going to be Austin or The Rock, period. So the fact that Jericho came out on top, to me, as a fan, made me very, very happy. I was thrilled to see that. I was happy for Jericho. I thought he made a great heel, and I thought he would do well, holding the titles and they'd be able to pass it off to a babyface at WrestleMania. Now, this was around the time that Triple H was coming back. Just a couple of weeks after Chris Jericho's victory, Triple H would return to the WWE at that huge pop that he got at Madison Square Garden, after his nearly year off because of his quad injury. And his first match back is the Royal Rumble, and he wins the Royal Rumble, which gives him the right to challenge the WWE Champion at WrestleMania. So this sets up the feud with him and Chris Jericho, and they talk now about Chris Jericho's alliance with Stephanie McMahon. It was his feud with Stephanie that really helped, get him on the map and really get fans behind him and make him obscenely popular. And now they were coming full circle because Triple H and Stephanie weren't going to be able to be together anymore. Triple H was coming back as a babyface, but his wife is a horrendous heel, and there's no turning her babyface. It ain't going to happen. And they thought it would be a good idea to align Stephanie with Jericho so that can help with his feud with Triple H, and, the whole thing can tie in together. Jericho mentions that he didn't really like it. His chemistry with her was not as good when they were aligned, from when they were against each other. It was much better when they were enemies. He talks a lot, too, about the main event of WrestleMania 18, and they mention that, Austin and The Rock kind of stole the show, and it really made the main event kind of sucky because the fans were burnt out. They weren't into it. And even though Jericho and Triple H were in the ring having a great match, the fans, you know, they were just completely emotionally spent from the drama that they got from Rock and Hogan. And I gotta say, I remember this WrestleMania well. To this day, every wrestler says, oh, that Rock-Hogan match should have been the main event. There's no way anybody could follow that. I disagree. When they first booked that match, I don't think the WWE had any idea, you know, that the fans were crazy. I don't know if they realized that Toronto was one of those towns, you know, that's kind of like Bizarro Land. They hadn't experienced that yet. And for somebody like me who hadn't seen Hulk Hogan in the WWE for almost 10 years, it was really surreal to see him back. And I think the fact that he was back and the fact that he was in Toronto, you know, a place where he had a huge WrestleMania match at WrestleMania 6, you know, those fans were almost so excited to see him back just for nostalgia purposes that they were cheering him. And the crowd is what carried that match. I don't know if the WWE would have been smart to book that match in the main event. Looking back, you know, they would have been smart to do that, but I think at the time, you know, that match wasn't going to be that great. The Rock was going to have to carry an old and slow and crappy Hulk Hogan. In Hulk Hogan's best days, I think he sucked in the ring. You know, now he's an old man, and how the hell is he going to be able to keep up with a buck like The Rock? But this was one of those matches where it was all entertainment. The fans were going to be hanging on everything that they did. Every punch, every kick was going to mean something, you know, where if you take the fans out of it and put that same match in an empty arena, you're going to say, this is two of the worst wrestlers I have ever seen. That Rocky guy seems to be a pretty good athlete, but the guy he's working with sucks. So to me, the crowd is what made that match. The crowd is what made that moment so special and so legendary. I have no doubt that it was going to be a WrestleMania moment. Just the very idea that The Rock versus Hulk Hogan was even happening, to me, was very surreal. And it's a match that I never, ever thought I would see. But as far as the quality of the match we were going to get in the ring, I was not expecting anything special. And I don't think the WWE was either. I don't think it would have been right to give the main event to a guy that worked so hard against the WWE to put them out of business for the previous 9 years. Now he's going to come back. He's been back to the company for 1 month, and you're going to give him the main event at WrestleMania? You can't do that. I'm surprised how many wrestlers to this day still say that Rock and Hogan should have been the main event of WrestleMania 18. I think that would have been a slap in the face to Jericho and Triple H and to their title and to the whole company and to the whole roster of guys that have been working there so hard, you know, to put WCW out of business, which is what made Hogan come back to the WWE in the first place. I think it would have been wrong. It would have been morally wrong to do that, and I'm glad that they didn't do it. Yes, the title match suffered for it. Jericho talks about that extensively, how he thinks they had a good match, but the crowd just, you know, they just weren't into it, and it was a letdown. After he loses the title to Triple H, he kind of flounders a little bit in 02, and they actually fast forward all the way up to the point where they give him the highlight reel, which I can't even remember when that debuted. I want to say maybe late 02, early 03. You guys can help me on that. But they showed a lot of clips, you know, from the highlight reel and all the different guests he had on and all the funny things he said and the obscenely expensive Geratron 5000, which, you know, to me looked like a little 42-inch TV that you can buy for $150 on Craigslist. And I believe the highlight reel is what might have kick-started Jericho and Shawn Michaels' feud. I can't remember. I do know they had a promo in the ring. Maybe it wasn't the highlight reel, but Jericho ended up getting super kicked by Shawn Michaels, and Jericho was funny in the DVD. He poked fun at Shawn's horrendous haircut. Remember when Shawn came back in 02 and how short his hair was? They were in this funny in-between time where long hair was starting to get out of style, but at the same time, you know, Shawn's long hair is what helped make him, and it's like he couldn't completely let go. Jericho did the same thing a couple of years later. He would cut it short, but not all the way short. And I actually think, looking back, laughing now, I think the worst Shawn had ever looked was when he won the title at Survivor Series 2002. He had that horrible haircut, and he was wearing those, like, shit brown trunks. He kind of looked like a little Amish schoolgirl or something. He just didn't look right. And I think it was funny that Jericho was ribbing Shawn a little bit on the DVD about his hair. But this was a big deal to Jericho. You know, he was going to be working with his idol. He patterned himself after Shawn Michaels. You look at the photos of Jericho when he was training to wrestle, you know, he did the same thing. He wore the same type of outfits that the Rockers would wear. He looked a lot like Shawn Michaels, had the same haircut, had the same style. You know, he patterned himself after Shawn. It was the same way Benoit patterned himself after Dynamite. And unfortunately for Benoit, he was never able to wrestle Dynamite Kid in the WWE. But here Chris Jericho is, you know, and he gets to work with Shawn Michaels and has a huge program with him that's going to lead to a WrestleMania match. You know, I've mentioned many times why I never, tried to become a pro wrestler, because I just don't think I would have been able to handle the politics and the bullshit and the crap that goes along with being a pro wrestler, that I would just get frustrated and just say the hell with this. But there's those certain instances where I'm like, wow, if I could be guaranteed that I could do something like that, I would definitely be a pro wrestler, because being able to work with one of your idols on a stage like that, I can only imagine how great that must have felt for Chris Jericho to be able to work with Shawn and be able to work with Shawn, on such a big stage. I remember how happy I was for Edge when Edge won the tag team titles with Hulk Hogan. Remember that? Because Edge was a young kid growing up in Toronto. He was a huge fan of wrestling in the 80s. He was at WrestleMania 6, big Hulk Hogan fan. And then years later, he gets to team with him and win the tag team titles. That had to be, just an amazing feeling for Edge. Just like it had to be an amazing feeling for Jericho to work this great program with Shawn. And these are the type of things that says, wow, if I was a pro wrestler and I had a chance to do that, then it would make it all worth it. There's only a couple of things in the Shawn Michaels-Jericho feud that I was a little bit disappointed with. One was the Royal Rumble. I love the angle that they did. Shawn Michaels was number 1. Chris Jericho was supposed to come out number 2. And then when his music hits and he comes out to the aisleway, he turns around and it's Christian. And then Chris Jericho sneaks into the ring from behind, beats the shit out of Shawn, and eliminates him from the Royal Rumble. I remember at the time watching that being so pissed off, because to me, having Shawn Michaels back was still a new idea. He had that one match at SummerSlam, and then he got injured and then returned, I think, at the Elimination Chamber where he won the title, maybe had a match or two on Raw, and then lost the title to Triple H at Armageddon. So to see Shawn Michaels in the Royal Rumble as the number 1 entrant, just like he was in 1995, I was really excited as a fan to see that, and I was pissed off that Shawn was eliminated right away and I didn't get to see him in the Royal Rumble. But it was still a great way to set up his match with Chris Jericho, because now Jericho cost Shawn Michaels his opportunity, to challenge for the title. And all of their segments leading up, to the WrestleMania match was great stuff. Great mic work, great interviews, great promos on each other. It was all great. And then we get to the match at WrestleMania 19, and Chris Jericho says it's one of the greatest moments of his career. And I do say it was a great match. I actually, believe it or not, I know this sounds crazy, I don't rank this WrestleMania match as high on the list as a lot of people do. I loved the match. Don't get me wrong. I thought it was great. But I don't think it was Savage Steamboat quality. Close, but not quite. Honestly, I don't even think it's Brett and Owen quality. It was an awesome match, but most people put this on their greatest WrestleMania match list a little bit higher than I do on mine. After the feud with Shawn, they talk about his alliance with Christian and what a great tag team they made, considering the fact that they were just thrown together. They had great comedic chemistry. Everything they were doing was comedy-based, but yet they were respectable wrestlers at the same time, and they had a lot of similarities between, the tag team of Edge and Christian, as far as their attitude goes and some of the tricks they were pulling and things like that, kind of being the cowardly little cocky heels. They played those parts perfectly. I loved the tag team. They eventually split up and had the match at WrestleMania 20. What led to that match was the hilarious bet that they made over which one of them could nail Trish or Lita, and the winner of the bet would get $1 Canadian. And I love the way they always had to remind everyone that it was a Canadian dollar, not a U.S. dollar, which was probably the funniest part of the whole angle. But Christian was going to supposedly go after Lita, and Jericho was going to go after Trish. And apparently Jericho started falling for Trish. Trish found out about the bet, overhearing Jericho and Christian talking about it, and she gets pissed. That leads to the split of Jericho and Christian, and Jericho actually turns babyface, really. I mean, Christian and Jericho were a heel team, but the whole angle made Jericho the babyface, Christian stayed the heel. And then their match at WrestleMania 20 had the great swerve at the end. Jericho finally, starts winning over Trish. She starts to forgive him for the bet that he made with Christian. And then she turns on him in the match, slapping him around, allowing Christian to hit his finisher and get the pinfall on Jericho, and, winning in what I thought was a great WrestleMania match. They basically move ahead in the DVD all the way up until Chris Jericho's firing in 2005. And Jericho talks a lot about that. And he talks a lot about how much he respects John Cena. And he put him over, and he defended his work in the ring and said, hey, he's a little bit unorthodox, but, he's had some pretty decent matches with a lot of big stars in the business spanning, a decade now. And, this idea that Cena can't wrestle isn't entirely accurate. And the feud that he had with Cena in the summer of 2005, I believe this was a SummerSlam match for the title, and it was, I think, the first time that the fans, because Jericho, was about to leave, the fans always respected Jericho even though he was a heel, but John Cena, this was one of the first times I can remember where the crowd started turning on Cena. He had just won the title at WrestleMania 21. I think he was still pretty over as the Thuganomics guy at that point, and it did not take long after he won the WWE title that a lot of fans started turning on him, and this was one of those shows. And the crowd was pretty much split 50-50. Let's go Jericho, let's go Cena. It was a pretty good match, and Cena beat Jericho at SummerSlam, which led to the next night on Raw. Jericho said, give me another shot at the title, and if I lose, I'm out of the WWE or I'm fired. Bischoff was involved in this angle as well. Cena, of course, beats him in the main event, and then that leaves Jericho begging Eric Bischoff, please give me one more chance, don't fire me. Eric Bischoff fires him, and security literally drags Chris Jericho out of the arena. And Jericho was funny. He talked about how the fans were so mad at the time, how the WWE did that to him, making him look like a fool on his way out the door, and he just cracked up at how silly, the fans can be and how dumb the dirt sheets are, because that's what he wanted to do all along. That's what bad guys do. That's the way bad guys are booked, and that's the exact type of shit Jericho likes to do. I mean, go back to what I talked about earlier with the 1,004 holds. Remember how absurd and stupid that segment was? But it was just who Chris Jericho is when he's a bad guy. I don't think there was any other way for him to leave other than to leave kicking and screaming, and I thought it was brilliant. And I even remember at the time on Jericho's website, as a matter of fact, just to troll the fans, Jericho, right after he was fired by the WWE, he put a banner of himself under a TNA logo on his website, or a picture of himself doing his Jericho pose with a TNA logo over top of it, and that got the dirt sheets and the websites going crazy. I'm sure if you Google, Jericho TNA image or something like that, something similar will come up, but I remember that being up there, and the only reason Jericho did it, he never had any intention at all to go to TNA. I doubt he even had a conversation with them. He only did it to get the wrestling world buzzed and get the wrestling world talking when he was gone. But I thought it was brilliant the way he kind of teased the fans and got everybody talking, just for shits and giggles, just to amuse himself. During his time off, they talk a lot about his personal life, his family. He has twins, he's married, of course, all of the stuff that he does with Fozzy, touring all over the world. He's also wrote the book. He's actually written 2 books. Both, I believe, were New York Times bestseller. Now he's got a podcast even more recently. They don't talk about that in the DVD, of course, because it's several years old, but Jericho always keeps himself busy, and that's what they chronicled, basically, in the piece that they did during the time he was away from the WWE, was his personal life and his outside interest in what he does when he's not wrestling. Now we're on to his return, 2007. They started filming those vignettes, hyping up Jericho's return, and I think right from the start, as soon as they started playing those Breaking the Code vignettes that they were doing, we all knew that was going to be Chris Jericho. And he did talk a lot about how when he first came back that, even though he was gone only 2 years, a lot had changed. And I remember Jericho did not come back with the same, it just didn't feel like the same Jericho. It wasn't just because he cut his hair. He came back to the same music and the same outfits, essentially, and the same character. But, something there, Jericho was missing something. So after a little bit of that, he decided to turn heel, and the direction he went with his character was just brilliant because he pulled it off so well. He went in a complete opposite direction and did it really well in his douchebag, suit-wearing, cocky Nick Bockwinkel type heel that he was trying to portray, and he even gave Nick Bockwinkel a nod. He even said he took a little bit of that character from him, because of what he saw in the AWA. When Bockwinkel was champion, the way he would always use big words and he would speak eloquently and wear suits and, always be nicely dressed and, talk down to people, he took a lot of that, character style from him. This was all sparked during his feud with Shawn. As a matter of fact, I think Jericho was still a face. They did the segment on the highlight reel where Jericho called out Shawn Michaels and started giving him shit and then threw him through the obscenely expensive Jeritron 5000 face first. And you know what? I really need to go back myself and take a look at some of those matches. This would have been, 2008, when Shawn Michaels had the retirement announcement at SummerSlam, and it led to, a series of matches between Shawn and Jericho. And I think Jericho ended up winning the title later on that year in the same night that he lost to Shawn. But I actually think, even though I don't remember much about it, I do need to go back and watch this again. But I think their 2008 feud was better than the one they had in 2003. It was very high drama and high emotion, and I think the WWE let both guys kind of take the wheel, with the whole thing, because they're such good pros that I remember them, being able to work out a lot of their promos and a lot of their angles, with each other with very little input from the creative team. And I thought that was great that they were able to, build that themselves organically. It was awesome. The last few things they they talk about in the DVD was also his brief feud with Rey Mysterio, which I thought was really good. They had a great series of matches during that time. And his feud with Edge. And they were originally supposed to be a tag team. Edge got hurt. I think they had big plans for Jericho and Edge at the time. They kind of reminded me of a rated RKO. I think they were going to have the type of push that Randy Orton and Edge had at the time. They were going to make them a team like that, an extremely dominant team, and then all of a sudden Edge gets hurt. And they end up sticking Chris Jericho with the Big Show instead, and Jericho says he loved it. He said it was one of his favorite tag team partners of all time. They were called Jericho. I was never a really big fan of Jericho, and I thought the Big Show looked ridiculous in that big blue outfit he was wearing, but they even won the tag team titles too, and Jericho says he enjoyed his time with the Big Show, even though they were just thrown together because, you know, they weren't expecting the Edge Achilles heel injury. Edge was out for a while, I think almost a year, maybe less. He came back at the Royal Rumble the next year and won it and challenged Chris Jericho for the title at WrestleMania 26, which Chris Jericho ended up winning. And I remember liking that. I was happy to see Jericho retain a title. It's so rare to see titles retained at WrestleMania as it is. And for Jericho to hold on to the world title that night, I thought was awesome. Since this was a 2010 release, the last thing they talk about on the DVD was Chris Jericho being the pro, the NXT pro of Wade Barrett when WWE started NXT. This would be, you know, the beginnings of the Nexus storyline. And Jericho said he really enjoyed that. He liked being able to pass along all of the knowledge he has. I mean, I think Chris Jericho would make a great trainer or a great agent. The problem is, I don't think Jericho is ever going to want a job like that in the WWE because he has so much going on in his personal life. But during that short time when he was the pro of Wade Barrett, he said he enjoyed, you know, giving advice and, you know, giving guys pointers and helping them along and telling them what to do, and it was a role that he really liked having. And here we are 4 years later, and Wade Barrett, you know, he's an okay star. You know, he hasn't reached it to the level that a lot of people had hoped he would yet, but it's still early. He's still young, and his most recent reign as Intercontinental Champion currently, you know, could help, you know, elevate him a little bit more. Who knows? But I have no doubt whatsoever that if Wade Barrett ever does make it to the big time, he will credit Chris Jericho, you know, a lot with, you know, helping him a great deal in the beginning. I enjoyed this DVD. The WWE does great documentaries on all these wrestlers and all of these DVDs they've done. I think the WWE does a great job with all of them. This was one of my favorites. If for no other reason than the WWE has got endless amounts of material to work with. Chris Jericho had an amazing career. He took an amazing road. He traveled worldwide, and he perfected his craft in lots of different countries and lots of different areas all around the globe. He worked for multiple promotions. He won multiple titles, and he worked multiple styles. And I think, you know, that's what every wrestler should aspire to be, you know, as far as your experience goes, is to, you know, create a body of work like that for yourself. And it's just a completely different era now. And Jericho's a dying breed. He's semi-retired right now. I don't know if we'll see Jericho wrestle again or not. I'm sure that we will. But either way, whether he wrestles again or not, he's not going to be wrestling a lot more. I think if we ever see Chris Jericho again, it might just be for a retirement run. But as a fan, I enjoyed Chris Jericho's career immensely. I give this DVD a solid A. I appreciate you guys kicking back and reliving Chris Jericho's career with me. It was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I will be catching you very soon with another one. Until then, peace.